is now a former Trump Fed board nominee, Judy Shelton. She's a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. And I wanted to get some of your comments, Judy, based on what we've been talking about for, I guess it's just this week. It happened over the weekend with the overbuilding or the renovation, cost overruns, et cetera, et cetera. That's not your main gripe, is it, with the state of the current Fed and with Jay Powell's tenure, or the tenure even goes back before that? You have other gripes.
Well, I think if we're going to look at the Fed's accountability for price stability, that alone deserves scrutiny, and the actions of the Fed need to be challenged. Nobody got fired for 8.6% on the CPI. They haven't hit their target in years. And we have someone at the Federal Reserve who cannot be fired ever by anyone. That's not accountability. So I think this confrontation between the Federal Reserve and the White House needs to be played out. I applaud the president for shaking things up, because the Fed has become too powerful, too prominent, and way too political. And it's about time that we start saying, what does it mean to be responsible for price stability? And we could say that the Fed has possibly misappropriated funds because it has, in the last 3 years, it has paid banks over $500 billion interest on cash balances kept at the Fed. I mean, we need to be challenging the mechanisms of the Fed. What about issues of private credit? Private credit has been exploding. What is that doing to the money supply? And does the Fed just have blinders on? Because if the rise of private credit threatens financial stability, that doesn't come under their purview of regulatory oversight. And if it's not threatening financial instability, then why do we even have a Fed? If private credit can equilibrate demand and supply for loanable capital and allow the economy, the private sector, to grow, that's the best way to fight inflation. Why doesn't the Fed go along with the same model? So,
hey, Judy, by the way, I don't disagree with you about this issue that the Federal Reserve shouldn't be held accountable, that there shouldn't be conversations about these issues that you're raising, that the questions shouldn't be asked. The question I would ask you, though, and this is, I think, a serious question, is in the context of what this investigation is about, which is about effectively perjury around the renovation of a building and a criminal probe and a criminal investigation, whether that unto itself is coercive, which is to say, I think the American public deserves answers about why the cost overruns have taken place and the like. And if you want to hold hearings about that, we should. If you want to have audits about that, we should. All of that. And if we want to have broader conversations about the success or failure of the Fed in the context of private credit, and I would even we could get into short-term debt and all sorts of things that have taken place over the last decade, if not more, or even more recently. But once you start to examine things from the Department of Justice perspective in terms of something criminal, it moves to a different level, and it effectively, by default, is questioning the very integrity, not of the Fed, but of Jay Powell as a person. And you've seen so many other former Fed chairs, central bankers around the world, CEOs and others effectively come to his defense. So I would ask you, would you come to his defense on that particular issue? Do you believe he is a man of integrity? Do you believe that he is lying, that he is perjuring himself, that he is purposely lying to the American public?
I think he tried to poo-poo the overspending. And I think he tried to suggest that this was all a ruse. And it was showing this underlying belligerence, which was then expressed in this very defiant statement, where the president of the Federal Reserve ended up saying, I have deep respect for the rule of law, and then immediately said he was dismissing as unenforceable and invalid an inquiry from the Department of Justice, which is the way we administer rule of law, and then invokes this sacred cow that, oh, you're violating central bank independence. I mean, to me, people like to say President Trump acts like a king. I think the chairman of the Fed behaves like an emperor and thinks he doesn't have to answer. And for him to then receive support from other central bankers who then say, because our job is to be in service to citizens. If their job is to deliver price stability, and the
Right.
chairman of the Fed often says that is their responsibility, I think the people would recall them. Nobody voted for them.
Judy, I think the issue is about potentially lawfare in this case.
Sorry?
I think the issue in this case is whether this investigation represents what might be described as lawfare, meaning you have a president who's been publicly critical of somebody. They've made it clear that they would like them not to be in this role, and then to see the legal system, the Department of Justice, get used in such a way. The perception in the American public, I think, broadly, if we were to poll people, is that effectively the Department of Justice is now doing the bidding of the president. That is the argument, and that is the perception. What do you think about that?
I think that you're suggesting this nicety, and that things like mortgage fraud and other issues should be brushed under the table. These are just no, but Andrew,
that's not what this case is about.
Andrew, think of when President Trump questioned our NATO allies. They're not contributing appropriately to the collective defense of the Western alliance, and the eye rolling in the military establishment of how dare you.
Now we're talking about all sorts of other things. I'm making a very distinct point, which is there is a view in this country right now, unfortunately. And by the way, you can argue that lawfare was used against the president when he was not the president after his first term, right? That argument's been made by Republicans repeatedly. The president's made that argument repeatedly. The question now is whether the president effectively is using lawfare, if you will. And there's been arguments made that lawfare has been used in the context of law firms, against media companies, against James Comey and others, by the way, where judges have effectively, said as much pretty directly, frankly, and whether this is an example of that.
Andrew, when President Trump was a victim of lawfare, he was sitting in that courtroom every day. He went through the process. That is not the attitude of Chairman Powell. He is saying, I do not have to go through the process because this is just a pretext to criticize.
You don't believe that President Trump was sitting in the courtroom because he had to sit in the courtroom? And you don't believe that President Trump back then was saying he shouldn't be sitting in the courtroom?
No,
of course he was saying he shouldn't be sitting in the courtroom.
I'm saying he went through the process, and Chair Powell was refusing to answer inquiries from the Department of Justice. They said that their requests for information were ignored. So should then they drop the case because he's the chairman of the Fed? He said even the chairman of the Fed is not above the law. And then he has the hubris to say, but he is above the law. He doesn't have to respond to that because it's not real. He basically said that an inquiry into the potential misappropriation, misuse, mismanagement of substantial funds for this project is just a pretext, and he doesn't have to respond. And that's the danger, that he is putting himself above the law. How else are we going to question the actions of the Fed? If they can always use this cloak of central bank independence, Congress is fine with that, because then the Fed returns the favor and says, and we won't question fiscal policy. So then the real cause of inflation is the deficit spending. But then the Fed accommodates that. They purchase the Treasury debt that finances it, and then they corral it by holding these cash reserves and then pay the banks to keep them from going into the real economy.